So welcome to the 8th Annual Roundtable for the Relational Coordination Research Collaborative. We call it the RCRC. And as you know, the theme is relational dynamics of multi-level systems change. And what I like about having it here at the Harvard Ed School, you may have seen the banner as you came in, learn to change the world. So it's learning for the sake of creating positive change, so very much in line with what the RCRC and all of you are trying to do in the world. So we thank you for that. And it's a really critical time to be gathering to talk about multi-level systems change. If you think about, shared goals, shared knowledge, mutual respect at every level from the institutional to the interpersonal are pretty important. And case in point, the hearings that are going to be happening this morning, and hopefully we'll see some of that. So we have 2 packed days of learning. And we're going to start off with an intro to RC, looking back, looking forward. Then we have a lot of cutting-edge research and practice that many of you will be presenting in these 3 areas. We'll talk about that in a moment. And then we have a keynote by Dr. Phil Thompson, who is a longtime friend and colleague, and from this Boston area, at least his career right now, but he's down in New York as one of the deputy mayors right now. Trying to create positive change in New York City, the Big Apple. Then we're gonna, after that, we'll disperse throughout the city for these welcoming activities, led by many of the people on our Boston Host Committee, and then regather at City Hall tonight, which is at Park Street stop on the Metro, on the T. But for now, I just wanted to see if Tanya Elaine, who I'm co-hosting with, we're co-chairing actually the host committee. If you have anything you want to share before I hand it off to our next speaker.
I don't think I have much. I think the restrooms down the hallway to the right, if you're looking for them. When we're breaking out later, we're going to break out in this space. So it breaks out into 3 rooms. So it'll be room 1 down there, 2, and then 3 over here. But just, that's it. Welcome, everyone.
And you probably already know Tanya, but she's the Director of Partner Relations and Communications for the RCRC. So you've had a chance to meet her. And for now, I'm thrilled to hand it off to a very esteemed colleague from Boston College, Dr. Jean Bartunek, who is part of our host committee and is going to give us a brief welcome. Thank you.
Is this, like, I get it? Okay. So, on behalf of the host committee, which you have all seen is much bigger than Jody and Tanya, I'm very glad to add my own welcome to our gathering today. I'd just like to say a couple things. I'm a relative newcomer to this group, part of it for the last year, but I know that some of you have been part of it for many years. This is the 8th annual gathering. And you come from a lot of places. We're all gathering right across the river from Boston. To those of you who are from Boston, you know that you like to think of this as the hub of the universe. To any of you who are not from Boston, you might have some other thoughts. Like if you're from Cleveland, Ohio, as I am, where I was born, and lived for many years, where JP lives now, or if you're from any other city, I would imagine that if you haven't learned yet what it means to be in the hub of the universe, you will definitely know by the end of today. So the point of this thing is learning, right? So we might as well do some in practice. I also like to say, as a relative newcomer, one of the things I've learned for sure is that what Jody has created is not Max Weber's relational coordination or any of the other European continental sociologists. But I think actually I've been very impressed with what she has developed in terms of new ways of thinking about how people and technology and structures can connect or not in organizations. It's particularly impressive to me that she's not only done it in terms of organizations and their structures, but she's also done it in terms of academics and our relationships with people with real jobs who we laughingly call practitioners. So I'm delighted to be among you all, and I'm looking forward to learning a lot. So thank you very much, and we're glad you're here.
So JP and I are going to do a little bit of a tag team here, kind of quick intro to relational coordination. And it's not really a traditional cover slide, but I would just start with, it can be confusing sometimes because relational coordination is three things. It's a construct, something you can actually measure and see how it affects other things. It's a theory, and basically with the construct, I would think it's helpful to say it's really about managing interdependence through relationships and shared goals, shared knowledge, mutual respect. But it's also giving a name to something that we didn't invent. It's been around for a long time in different forms, and we're just giving a name to it here. And figuring out how to get our arms around it and measure it and try to make it stronger. And it's also a theory of performance that has other variables in it, structures that support these networks of relational coordination and outcomes that we expect to come from them. And some of those structures include things like shared accountability, shared rewards, shared conflict resolution processes. And then in addition to being a theory of performance, it's also become a theory of change. And that's really where JP is going to step in and take us from there. That's kind of like past, present, and future. The future is, how is this as a theory of change? And how does it play out at all these different levels, from the interpersonal to the institutional and the cross-organizational networks that so many of us are trying to build right now for various purposes, including community health and wellness, educating our youth, etc. A lot of efforts going on there at multiple levels to create change for more coordinated efforts to achieve outcomes we care about. So,
I'll click for you.
thank you, JP.
I have one.
I know, I took it.
Oh, you have it.
Yes, so I just pulled this up today. It's just, maybe it's a little outdated, but from some data we had a few months ago. Just doing kind of a Google Scholar search on just the term relational coordination, it's very interesting to see how cumulatively, these, and if you just look at the year-by-year results, it's pretty similar shape. But it's really become a more common term. And Google Scholar is where you find usually the more academic stuff. And probably in the practitioner you'd find something pretty similar, but it's become a more common term, and I think it's because it feels a need to describe something that we all know is important, but we didn't always have a term for it, and that, not to take a lot of credit, but the RCRC was founded right around there. That's around 2011. So I think we did help to, to spread the idea. So far, this theory has been empirically tested, and this keeps changing. There's now veterinary care and things that aren't on here, but in many industry contexts and in countries around the world, some of which you represent here. The core construct basically is just defined as communicating and relating for the purpose of task integration. And this is really a familiar visual to many of you. It can be working in a kind of positive reinforcing cycle, or in a fairly negative reinforcing cycle, which is more the siloed, disconnected networks rather than the highly connected networks. And either one can be hard to change because it's mutually reinforcing, right? The relationships and the communication. So it's basically a network of ties between key stakeholder groups that are involved in some common work process. We call it sometimes a focal work process. And we found ways to measure it, starting with my dissertation, using a 7-item survey that helps to kind of visualize these networks based on data. So here's one way, that dissertation many years ago was actually flight departures. And then, as many of you know, we quickly moved into patient care, which in some ways is even more complex because each patient is their own process in many cases. And now increasingly into other sectors, including K-12 education, which is what brought me here for my sabbatical last spring, where I got to meet a lot of experts in this area who are working very hard to change and improve public education for the sake of citizenry and democracy and well-being, and equity. So a lot at stake here with this one, as with the other ones. And some, if you actually sit down and measure it with a survey, you get kind of a sense of how strong are some of the ties, whether we're looking across organizations or across functions within an organization. So the weak ties, the strong ties, often when you're looking across organizations, as our colleagues here know, you can start out on the weak side because those are ties that we haven't really used that much in the past. So, moving from the construct to the theory, well, what are we saying? How do we get RC and why does it matter? Organizational structures can strengthen it by when they connect across multiple stakeholders, because that helps to reduce sub-goal optimization. People become more aware through shared goals of how it's not just about their goals, but about the broader goal that they share, and to increase systems thinking. When you get structures like a shared protocol or selecting for teamwork, that helps us to become more aware, again, of each other's needs. That builds shared knowledge and increases systems thinking. So those structures, some of them we've identified, they're always more to consider, like a shared space can be very important. How we actually design the space can be really helpful for, in terms of structures that cut across the silos to create a more connected network. And we're experimenting with these all the time. And then the second part of the theory, after we look at, here's some of the findings. People have empirically tested these, and there's, mixed results. I've been working with Carolyn Logan on identifying all the empirical findings that have been published thus far, including a bunch of dissertations, and we see a fair amount of support for this part of the theory. Next is basically probably a part you're more familiar with, and that is RC is expected to affect a bunch of different outcomes for multiple stakeholders. In part, doing that by relaxing some of the trade-offs, the either-or, toward more of a both-and by shifting out performance frontiers. And how does that look? I always find this a helpful visual, because we're often in this world of, well, we're either going to have high quality or we're going to be efficient, and which one do we want, and how do we make that trade-off the best way? But any fundamental process improvement, and we know this really from Lean and TQM and so much of the work on process improvement, that fundamentally improving the work process allows us to do better on both, to relax some of those trade-offs and push out our production possibilities frontiers so that we can maybe still have some trade-offs but at a higher level. And we think RC is one of those fundamental process improvements that lets us do better on multiple outcomes. And so these are the outcomes that are expected to be and have been found to be associated with RC: quality and safety, efficiency and financial, ability to engage more as partners with our clients, and to achieve higher levels of worker well-being, which I look at Chris at that moment, and she cares a lot about worker well-being, as do I. And even some recent work on how these relational dynamics help us to engage more easily in learning and innovation, because we're going beyond what we know about our job to seeing a broader system, and you see a lot more opportunities to change, and also you now have the networks to help you do it. So some of the findings around evidence regarding the performance outcomes are in here, and it's a review, systematic review that we're currently updating. This is at least a year old. So proposition 3 is that RC matters. It's basically a contingency statement. It matters most for performance when work is uncertain, highly interdependent, and time constrained. It might always be nice to have, but when you've got those conditions, it pushes you to need it more in order to get to those outcomes that you really want. So that's kind of the third and last piece of the theory. But that really brings us to the question that JQ is here to talk about, which is, I would say in the last 5 years, probably since we started this collaborative in 8 years ago in 2011, we created it partly to bring together researchers and practitioners to figure out not just what predicts what, but how do you actually do it, right? How do you actually get out there and create this kind of change using insights from the theory, but then pushing it further by working in the field, trying to actually. So that's what I want to turn over to JP, because he wants to talk about it, and he's really good. Happy JP.
Thanks.
Thank you for doing this.
Yeah, good morning, everybody.
everybody. As Jody said, my name is JP, John Paul Stevens from Case Western Reserve, and it's kind of interesting being asked to sort of open up this new model, this approach to theorizing, because I'm trained as a psychologist, much more micro, but I've always been interested in, what's going on with individuals within a system. And, I appreciate Jody and everybody that's gathered here for the work, developing language and developing new insights to help us kind of advance those kinds of complex understandings. So part of moving forward, with Jody's work from 2012 handbook chapter, from the 2016 book, we have this relational model of organizational change, and I have my notes on my phone, so pardon me. I'm not looking at text. So as Jody showed, we have the relational coordination concept, communication dimensions, and relational dimensions, and they feed into each other, right? But that has to be supported by these interventions, and I'm starting at the bottom here in case you're not familiar with them. So for those who are frontline workers, colleagues and clients, they need to enact these relational interventions and work process interventions, such as creating a safe space, having the kinds of conversations that are needed to actually get the work done, enacting some of these work process interventions, some of which you may find if you've adopted kind of some lean principles as well. But it takes the people on the ground to actually put them into practice. But for those people on the ground, they need help, right? They need to be able to do that in a structure that supports what they're trying to accomplish. So can those who have the power and agency to shape the organization or the institution, middle and top leadership, what sorts of structures are they setting up? All right, so that's another aspect that Julie's done a lot of work on, along with all of you as our colleagues, looking at relational job design, starting off with selection and training. Are we, looking for people who actually have competency in terms of playing well with others? What does that even mean? What does that look like? How do you predict that? So this is really tough stuff, and I think the model, the ambition is how do you kind of plug in all these things simultaneously, right? As we start to talk more about a system. So that's the challenge ahead of us, because I would wager that most of us in our work have found that even if we focus on just one thing, we need to account for other things at other levels, right? Other dynamics. So there's a need for a holistic approach that's addressing inputs from across the system. And one way of digging deeper into this that we attempted in our professional development workshop at the Academy of Management meeting this August in Chicago was, how do we account for system level change through looking at multiple levels of analysis and doing so simultaneously, which to me is very exciting, but I think in general you get a headache after a while thinking about it, trying to keep it all in your head at the same time. And the reason we wanted to bring this up was, yes, to describe briefly some of the work that has been going on in between the two roundtables, but also to point out that there's a lot of this represented in this week's roundtable as well. So I'll just briefly, if you bear with me, I will kind of walk through some of these things here. So the idea was to parse out the various levels of analysis across change, to describe and understand what's needed at each level of change, and then also how the different levels are interacting, interfacing with each other. What do they need from each other, and how do they influence each other? So, and in the professional development workshop, we employed some conversations of independence to cite Tony Zuckman's work, to flesh out how those various levels interact with each other. So the specific question that we had was, what are the enablers of and barriers to change at each level, right? What does one level need from the other, and vice versa? And we used a case, I won't get into this here, but we used a case that showed, here's an example of how the different levels need each other, but also how they can kind of obstruct each other. So I'll just put it back here because that's going to be the main focus of my description. So at the interpersonal level, our understanding was that would relate to, how individuals are relating and talking to each other on a personal basis. At the cross-functional level, how do distinct functions, roles and occupations relate to each other? At the organizational level, how does organizational leadership and accountability dynamics impact systems change? Cross-organizationally, how do organizations involved in the same work process relate to each other in a context of systems change? And finally, institutionally, how do macro institutions representing distinct stakeholder interests impact systems change? Right? So the conversations we had in that room in Chicago, we had folks selecting into different levels, sussing out, what is it that, if I'm focused more at the interpersonal level, like somebody like myself, what is it that we need out from the other levels, and how do we impact the other levels? You had all these groups thinking and talking within levels and then across all the levels at the same time. So this is my attempt to summarize some of that. We'll see how this goes. So some of the things that we learned, which we were able to compile, that if I start off at the interpersonal level, right, and maybe these are thoughts you can take with you as you observe and listen and present over these next few days, like what's happening at each level. So one thing that we learned was that the interpersonal level is imperative for providing things like a conversational space, a conversational capacity to share ideas and hash out intended change, right? The surrounding levels, however, not only provide the structure and set the goals, but for, interpersonal dynamics, but those structures can shape the amount of respect, for example, that each other's needs are getting in the conversation. Right? So what are the norms being set up by the structures that are shaping interpersonal dynamics? At the cross-functional level, that's where people felt that systems can sense and calibrate alignment between metrics for success, right? So for system-level change, it's really important that the folks operating across functions are sensitive to how is it actually working out? How are we giving feedback to the system as a whole, right? Because that's where the action is happening, right, across the different functions. But the cross-functionality might only be successful when the surrounding levels promote things like shared cultural values and mutual respect. At the organizational level, we learned that it's really important for providing a shared language for the cross-functional and interpersonal levels, but it requires access to partners at higher levels. So cross-organizational and institutional levels, right? So there's this playing off of the organizational level provides some structure to lower levels, but also needs resources from the higher levels. Across organizations, the other levels benefit from displays by leaders of openness and transparency, but the other levels support cross-organizational efforts by sharing resources and providing those interpersonal threads that enact change. And finally, the institutional level provides the big umbrella catch-all commitment to change and a positive vision. Yet institutions need the individuals at the interpersonal level to air wicked problems, right? So the institution, which could be a constellation of different organizations, potentially, depending on how you define institutions, still is relying on the individuals and the relationships, the conversations that they're having to, put into practice in a recurring, sustainable way those norms. So individuals can also challenge those institutional norms and come up with solutions. Institutions also need organizations to design the proper incentives to foster the collaboration that then feeds back and sustains those institutions. So all that's to say is that I think the Roundtable is an opportunity to further explore these themes in generative conversations amongst all the folks represented here, from public policy, from medicine, academia, consulting, and education, just to name a few. And some of these themes, if you look through your schedule in the booklet, you'll see that the themes for the different breakouts kind of map onto some of these levels, right? So we have some themes about broader society, right? So social change through cross-organizational collaboration, making a public impact institutions and leaders, the big question of how can institutions better adopt and sustain relational coordination, especially through their leadership. Collaboration across a system, so treating large systems, whether it's in the medical industry or the construction industry, treating them as teams, like what does that even mean? And of course the role of individuals, right? So there's a breakout session on the role of communications and emotions in relational coordination. And then what I also thought was interesting, you do have things that are playing across levels in our breakout sessions. So the interplay of technology, for instance, right, which is very important across all of these levels. Another thing of note in reviewing the schedule was the focus on the recipients, right, which came up in our advisory board meeting yesterday. You know, are we looking at relational co-production as well? How do we bring in the users and the people that are being affected by the actions across all these different levels? And so there's breakout sessions on outcomes for students, for workers, for patients, for communities. Right? Just, I think the schedule really brings before a lot of options for us to consider as we're playing around, you know, today and tomorrow with how do these things actually weave together, right? How do we move forward in both practice and in theory with an understanding of how do we change the system, how do we shift it into a positive trajectory. So I hope that, you know, this brief summary of the things that emerged from this workshop this summer are food for thought for the rest of your time here. So welcome and have a great roundtable.
We have 5 minutes before a 15-minute transition to put up the walls and get into our first breakout. So any thoughts or questions to kind of put into the room in addition to that amazing presentation by JP, and you can't go anywhere. Reflections from your own experience of working across these levels and over there. Oh yeah, thank you. Oh yeah, we have Abe over there.
Just a definitional thing, I wasn't really clear what's meant by institution. So you have organizational level at the middle.
Yeah.
Is it like a community level?
Yeah, it's a great question, and our colleague Joel Kutcher-Gershenfeld will be here shortly, and he's the one who said you've got to consider the institutional. And I think of it as the policy-making area. Like when we were in these conversations of interdependence that JP described across levels, all the other groups kept saying to the institutional group over there, if you guys would just change the payment structure so that we can all work together more easily, we would be fine. Remember that, Angela? It's like everyone saying, all you have to do is change the policies. And the people there finally said, okay guys, if we're going to do that, we need all your help. Right? So it's the policy-making area, things that I'm from the Heller School for Social Policy and Management, along with Raj and others, and we think a lot about social policy. So how do those policies get set in a way that frames and shapes what organizations can actually do? I think about it sometimes as an institutional context.
Or field.
Or field, yeah, depending on, okay, yeah. And we kind of sometimes treat it as an external variable, but really we could be part of shaping it, and often we are.
So I think another question I sort of have is I just look at this diagram, which I really like. I like the blues and the greens. I like separating this sort of the areas in between that are sort of operating in between. But I'm wondering about the interpersonal that's happening everywhere. I mean, interpersonal isn't isolated really, and it's not only shaped by everything. It's occurring everywhere too. So since JP, you were coming from that interpersonal zone, how do you think about that in this diagram, maybe, or in this thinking, or how can we think about that?
Yeah, I mean it's yeah. So it's always going to be an artificial framing, right? Just for the sake of analysis and facilitating some conversation and thought. I completely agree with you. I'm sort of, at least personally, intellectually, I'm still. It's hard for me to keep it, you know, the figure ground, because, you know, as a science, we kind of are forced to impose that false set of distinctions. So I completely agree with you. You know, if we think about structuration theory, for instance, you know, we have to account for, you know, this thing that we're trying to describe and explain. In this case, a system. It could be an organization. We have to take into account the micro level and the macro level simultaneously. I'm more interested in, you know, across those levels, how do we, and I don't know if this is quite what you're getting at, Kathy, but how would we account for the individual, what they're thinking, feeling, doing, in relation to other individuals, when they're in cross-functional roles, when they're interfacing with the larger system at the organizational level, whether they are at the cross-organizational, institutional level, because in the end, I think you just have a choice point, if that makes sense. It's not always, this isn't necessarily about, say, lower level employees, if anybody interpreted it that way, right? Because I think we all have stories of change where it is certain individuals that are shaping change. Just it's a simple conversation that happened, for instance, which is really remarkable. So I completely agree with you that the interpersonal, the individual and dyadic and triad, they all are enmeshed there. But how to talk about it, as you can tell, it's hard.
I have an interesting story from yesterday, because Kathy, you were facilitating our advisory board meeting. And we're basically coming together as multiple organizations, partners, to guide this network. And you kept saying, don't forget the human part, you know, and we were telling our personal updates as well as what's going on in our work. So there we are in a cross-organizational kind of capacity, really relying also on the interpersonal for that to be effective. So is that, maybe we just need a lot more arrows.
Or maybe, I mean, just quickly, just quick.
Yeah, please.
Maybe this diagram needs to come in a couple formats, you know, so it can just be seen, you know, this vertical format, or maybe there's some sort of horizontal format, you know, beside it, so that it doesn't just feel like the typical hierarchy, which relational coordination kind of works in a different direction.
Right. And that was an issue that came up in the workshop, like how are we, is there a bias in how this is flowing? And yes, there is. So we have one more.
wanted personal up there.
Karen has the last question because we're doing the
Yeah, it's not a question, it's a suggestion connected to Cassie's comment. The interpersonal level, could it be that we could call it the intergroup or inter-team level? Collaboration within the smaller team or group. And then interpersonal level is, as Kathy said, at all levels. But there is something going on within the smaller team or unit.
Okay.
That's definitely a possibility, and I just, Laura's not speaking up right now, but I just wanted to put in a plug for a 6th level that she and others became aware of during this workshop. Okay, which is, you want to speak to it?
It's the intrapersonal level, really. It's the self level. It's our self.
The intrapersonal is
Coming to terms with our own self so we can meaningfully, book, which is also going on all the time at every level. Cool.
So just before we wrap, so Laura was just saying we probably need to attend to the intra-psychic, the within the individual level as well. So I want to be mindful of the time. We do need to transition, but thank you for the thoughts and feedback. Hopefully conversations keep going throughout the day.
Yeah, and track 1 is meeting over here, track 2 in the middle, and track 3 over there. The walls will start to slowly close, so don't get quiet.